And we are recording. So welcome everyone to the April 14th Marijuana Legislation Advisory Committee meeting. Thank you all for attending. Our first item on the agenda is public comment. So if you are a member of the public and you're attending, just raise your hand and we'll promote you so that you're able to speak. We don't see anybody, so we're going to move on. We've got a presentation from a Quinnipiac University law student, Vincent Demore, and Vincent, I'm going to go ahead and move you over.
Good afternoon. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, sir. Welcome to the meeting.
Thank you. Thank you for having me tonight. I appreciate the opportunity. I spoke with Aaron and my Professor Marjorie Shansky about this at length. And I have submitted to Aaron a PowerPoint as well as a paper that I hope you had the opportunity to at least glance over. The table of contents is hyperlinked, so anything you want to jump to or that piques your interest in that paper can be easily accessed. Just by way of background, my name is Vincent Demore. I'm a third-year law student at Quinnipiac. I work at the law firm of Marino, Zabel, and Schellenberg as a law clerk, where I primarily do land use and municipal work. Lost track there. And do I have the ability to share my screen here?
Yes.
Well, you should. I don't think I've locked you out. So.
Oh boy.
Looks like I can.
Okay.
Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
So just by way of background, as I mentioned, I am a law student, so I'm not an attorney and this is not legal advice. I also put that disclaimer in the paper itself. But obviously this is the Marijuana Legislation Committee, which is directly responsive to Senate Bill 1201 and specifically the town of Madison's response thereto. Senate Bill 1201, I'm sure you all have looked at and is quite extensive, but there's certain provisions in there that are highly important to municipal governance and land use and zoning specifically. So by way of background, Senate Bill 1201, the act itself, as I mentioned, is very particular to municipal governance as well as police provisions. And so the implications on the town are not to be understated. There's a lot of considerations that the town has to make before acting on anything within the bill. So what I did is I took your committee's charge and I basically broke that down into an analysis based on the act itself, the town of Madison's zoning regulations, as well as other municipalities' zoning regulations, the statutes applicable to municipalities, which include, for this analysis, the Municipal Powers Act, as well as the zoning enabling legislation. I took what Madison is looking to get information on, and I took that information and sought it out from other municipalities, and I drew comparisons where necessary. Some of the municipalities I compared to are not necessarily neighboring towns, but they're towns that have took the initiative and acted early on Senate Bill 1201. And lastly, I think that this is a very hot topic issue, and there's a lot of logical considerations that the town and everybody else has to make before any decisions are made. So first, I took the committee's first charge, which is regulations on the usage on town-owned or public property. Specifically, Section 84 of the Act discusses this, which gives the town the authority to regulate either by zoning or ordinance the use of cannabis products on town-owned or controlled property. That includes, public fields, public parks, schools, town hall. This basically allows the town, if they desired, to ban the use of cannabis products, say outside of town hall. However, specifically, the act does not mention edible cannabis products, which is a large portion of retail sales. So that is a consideration that the town would have to make on whether they wanted to expand their ordinances or regulations to also govern edible cannabis products on these properties. I also looked at the town's current ordinances, specifically section 14-55, subparagraph 21, which, if you aren't familiar with, is the town's ordinance on tobacco use on these similar properties. And the town has banned tobacco uses on some of these properties, for instance, outside of schools and things like that. So that's one implication that is an easy comparison to make on how the town might want to act on cannabis smoking in those areas. And I also looked at, as I mentioned, several other towns throughout Connecticut. And there's an extensive list that you could see in my paper of towns that have already banned use on properties such as schools, town hall, public fields, public parks, and similar type properties. And some towns have gone even further to ban cannabis use on sidewalks, which are town-controlled property as well. It's an interesting consideration to make. I know, I'm not from Madison, but I know Madison has a thriving downtown. So it might be a consideration that Madison wants to look into, where they would ban use perhaps on the downtown sidewalks and not elsewhere, or all sidewalks altogether. And the committee is asked to look at whether they should regulate through ordinance or through zoning regulations. I'm going to discuss that later on, but specifically to the use on public property or town controlled property, this is definitely something that the town would want to regulate by ordinance. And again, some of those logical considerations I discussed earlier are the town would probably want to be in control of whether cannabis could be smoked, for instance, outside of the elementary schools. It might not be the best idea to have cannabis being smoked while young kids are being dropped off and picked up from school. It's also a consideration with the downtown area where families might be on the weekend. You might not want cannabis being smoked all around a family environment. And again, regulations through zoning versus an ordinance. The act specifically permits regulation through either of these methods. That's section 148 of the act. But then I broke this down into ordinance and zoning because I think they each have their place in regulating certain aspects of the act. So for the ordinance, I looked at the Municipal Powers Act, which is section 7-148 of the Connecticut General Statutes. And this basically defines as an ordinance as a rule or regulation of general application. That is why perhaps banning smoking on town-owned property would be an ordinance as opposed to a zoning regulation, because that's something that would apply town-wide to residents of the town and non-residents of the town. Additionally, an ordinance would be enforced via fine or other penalty. So there is a penal aspect of an ordinance. Conversely, the zoning regulations is governed by section 8-2 of the Connecticut General Statutes, which is a part of the Zoning Enabling Act, which gives municipalities the authority through their police power to act on zoning regulations. Some of these provisions allow towns to regulate the location of buildings, the type of use, height, size, signage, and all of these things are made in accordance with the town's comprehensive plan. They're supposed to be in sync with the comprehensive plan. Additionally, all the zoning regulations should have a rational relation to the public health, safety, welfare, and prosperity of the community. So that's something that we would take into consideration should the town desire to allow retail cannabis establishments. Next, I looked into regulations on use by municipal employees. This is probably the most wide discretion that the town would have after making their initial decision. There's options to prohibit use during work hours. There's options to prohibit use not during work hours. But the most important part of this is that the town enact some sort of written policy that clearly denotes whether municipal employees can use cannabis products, when they can use them, and where they can use them. The other consideration is the town employs people that are first responders, for instance, police, fire, EMS. These are included in a group of what are called exempt employees, which would not be governed by the act. Some additional employees under this would be employees that operate motor vehicles or equipment operators, perhaps public works employees, supervisors of children and medical patients, for instance, school teachers, and employees funded by a federal grant. Any employee funded by a federal grant would not be able to be subject to the town's permission to use cannabis products because, as you know, it is still not legal federally. So that is something that the town should consider in enacting its policy for municipal employees. Next, perhaps the biggest topic surrounding retail cannabis is municipal tax. It's certainly a great source of revenue. Per the act, municipalities would receive a 3% tax on all sales from retailers, hybrid retailers, and micro cultivators. That tax can be substantial. It's put into a trust at first. There's some state implications that happen, and then it is remitted to the municipality, and the municipality can use those revenue sources for what you see on the right-hand side of the screen, which I'll get to in just a moment. But as far as taxes, I think it's important to put it into perspective. Michigan is a state that has already allowed retail cannabis stores in municipalities. And on average, a Michigan municipality takes in $10 million annually on average from retail cannabis sales. Additionally, there's a organization in Connecticut that has been pushing for retail sales, and that is cited in my paper. And they are projecting $70 million in municipal tax revenue in the first 5 years of retail cannabis, with 21 million of that coming in the last year alone. But again, there's a limit on the revenue sources or where the revenue can be used. And it goes into the intent of the state in enacting this and the cautions they want to take. So neighborhood improvements is one that will seem very broad, but it's actually more narrow when you get into the actual language of the act. Neighborhood improvements such as streetscape improvements are limited to the location and where the retail establishment is set up. So the taxes that come from this cannot be put into, say, a residential improvement area if the cannabis establishment is not in that residential area. Additionally, the state has considered education. There's a push for youth education and youth employment training with the tax revenues. Additionally, the tax revenues can go to corrections and post-release parole and probation individuals that reside in the town of Madison. That can go towards recidivism type programs. Additionally, mental health and addiction, which I think speaks for itself, use of that to help people who suffer from any mental health or addiction type issues. And then youth services, which the town has also asked the committee to look into, which is definitely a big portion, which again goes to the intent of the state to want to educate and help youth before it becomes an issue for them, if at all. And then civic engagement, which it would be beneficial for the town. It's important that the town has all of its residents involved in these types of programs. And it's important that the town knows how residents feel about these types of issues. So that is where the revenue of those taxes can go. Law enforcement guidelines. The state has issued some law enforcement guidelines that get into very minute details about policing. And I know that Madison Police and State Police and all other municipalities have some great men and women in their law enforcement, but training is going to be very important in this aspect. There's some people, I'm sure, on the Madison Police Department that have been on the department for 20 plus years. Essentially, the act and the legalization of cannabis is going to reverse a lot of what they have been taught and what they have been practicing in the past 20 some odd years. For instance, in searches and seizures, police might have at one time had probable cause to perform a search based on the odor of cannabis or the sight of cannabis paraphernalia. That is no longer the case. Those are no longer arrestable offenses. So in order to, it goes back to the training, the police will really need to hone in on what the act says and what is legal and what is illegal now in light of the act. because it's going to turn on its head a lot of what has been done in the past for police. Another very important issue, and I'm not positive to the extent that Madison has a canine officer, but canine officers are going to be a very hot topic issue here. Perhaps not right as off the get-go, but it will probably become a large criminal law issue in the future. For instance, most canines that are trained to sniff out drugs are not trained for one drug alone. They're trained for marijuana, heroin, cocaine, fentanyl, and the list might go on and on. And now the issue becomes when police use a canine to, say, perform a sniff around a car, and say the canine alerts to what is cannabis in the car, and the police search the car because the canine alerted to it, and then they find evidence of a robbery that the canine didn't alert to. Police then take that evidence of the robbery, but there's the potential that all that evidence is what they call fruit of the poisonous tree, evidence that comes from an illegal search, because there was no probable cause to search in the beginning because the canine alerted to cannabis, a legal substance. Additionally, DUIs are going to be an issue. There's no breathalyzer to detect for marijuana intoxication. So police will have to be trained to recognize a lot of the signs of marijuana intoxication without being able to rely on a device that can give them an affirmative answer, yes or no. Federal law enforcement assistance. A lot of times municipalities will interact with federal agencies to assist in an investigation in their municipality. The Act specifically prohibits assistance of federal law enforcement as it relates to cannabis or marijuana investigations. So that's something that might be an issue between federal agencies and the local law enforcement, but the Act specifically prohibits that. Along similar lines, department resource allocation cannot be put towards cannabis, marijuana investigations or enforcement. So this might also be an issue to the extent that Madison might have an ongoing investigation related to marijuana or cannabis. That investigation will essentially come to a halt because the resources of the department are no longer permitted to go towards that. Youth services, as I mentioned, the state has an interest in youth services by way of having 2 of the 6 tax revenue possibilities related to youth. Youth education is going to be very important in the event that even if Madison does not permit retail establishments, it's still important to educate youth, because if Madison doesn't allow it, Guilford might, or another neighboring town might. And when I was looking into this, I immediately thought of my high school days where MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, would come in and do a talk, which I believe they do essentially statewide all the time now. And it's something, a similar program should probably be implemented for cannabis. You have 2 substances that are illegal, or that are legal when you turn 21 years old. They both have potential adverse effects, and it's important to train the youth to know what they're getting themselves into and what those adverse effects can be, and how to use it responsibly. Next, I turn to my proposed regulations that I also submitted in my paper, and I'd implore you to turn to those now so that you can actually see word for word what they say. But what I did is I took the definitions directly from the Act. I think that using the Act's definitions will provide a lot of clarity and avoid a lot of confusion going forward. The definitions can get nuanced as you start to toil with them and turn them around. So to the extent that there's consistent regulations with the state and with the town, it will provide a lot of clarity for retail applicants in the event that it was permitted in Madison or for any other reason. I also put in a provision for the location should the town authorize retail establishments. I've selected 3 locations. For retail establishments, I selected a commercial district and an industrial district. I know the town already allows for a medical marijuana facility, which I believe is also in an industrial district. So I think that is a similar comparison, and I think that it feeds towards the purpose of the regulations. I don't think the town would want to put some sort of cannabis retail establishment, or any retail establishment really for that matter, right in the middle of a residential zone. Also a part of the location is the distance from those areas I spoke about earlier where we wouldn't really want cannabis to be smoked outside. So I set a separation limit that mirrors the medical marijuana regulation separation limit from those facilities like schools, town hall, public parks, and other such areas. I also, Madison has quite a comprehensive sign regulation. So for cannabis, I kept it simple, and I simply pointed towards the existing sign regulation because I think it's very comprehensive and covers everything that would need to be covered for signs on a cannabis establishment. Also, as it relates to signage, the act specifically prohibits certain types of advertising. So the town would have to toil with the idea of how they want to enforce that, or if they don't want to enforce it at all and let the act do the enforcement itself. For instance, you wouldn't allow a cannabis store to put, a sign like a tag sale sign a block ahead saying cannabis 1 mile ahead. So that's something that's specifically prohibited by the act. But the town can also put something in place in order to enforce that. And finally, the last option, which would completely negate everything I just said, and the town could outright ban cannabis retail establishments, microcultivators, and hybrid retailers. And that would likely be done via ordinance. But the town could also put some restrictions through their zoning on that by specifically excluding it. And so with that, I'd like to take any questions to the extent there are any.
Well, I'd like to start by thanking you for putting this together. This is a fabulous resource for us as we navigate through this process. You mentioned earlier on in the presentation, notionally the idea of cannabis versus tobacco, cannabis versus alcohol. And I'm wondering if you have an opinion, should the town look to those regulations and ordinances as guidelines for how to treat cannabis? Should we be relying on similar language and or just modifying the existing language to include cannabis?
I think it certainly has its place. Like I said, for instance, tobacco, the town has an ordinance that prohibits tobacco smoking and usage on town hall property. I think that is an ordinance that you can pretty much take out tobacco, add in cannabis, and you'd have somewhat of a sufficient ordinance to prohibit cannabis at those types of locations. Alcohol, as it goes, the act allows, alcohol can be purchased and used after you turn 21. The act allows that for cannabis. And to the extent that the town can do anything with that, I don't think there is much. But as far as youth education, I think it's very similar to the extent that they're both substances that have implications when you use them. And it's very important for the youth to know what those implications are and how it might affect them.
And certainly the public health aspect of this and the outreach aspect of this I think is super important. I think Fillmore, I saw you put your hand up.
Yes, I want to clarify, Vincent, thank you for that excellent presentation. Alas, your details did not come around until 4:30, and so I didn't get to read them before you spoke. But I have a question about what you just said. Are you implying that, and this has to do with where in town cannabis could be used? Did I understand to say that, okay, we can liken this to tobacco, and any place that has tobacco banned, we can ban cannabis, but that once you get to be 21, you could go in and use the cannabis any place where alcohol was allowed. As an example, I'll use our surf club, where you can drink beer out in the picnic area, but not down on the beach. So are you saying that if you're over 21, you could be smoking cannabis out in the picnic area?
So that's something that would be entirely up to the town. The town would have to consider locations where they would think it would be a bad idea to allow cannabis smoke, and then they would be able to regulate it to cater to their beliefs. I think the alcohol comparison was more for youth education. I think the tobacco smoking prohibition areas is more similar to the cannabis smoking prohibition areas. So for instance, if I was a cigarette smoker, I can walk into town hall with my pack of cigarettes in my pocket, but I can't go stand in front of town hall and smoke them. So it would be a similar scenario where I could potentially have cannabis in my pocket, but I can't smoke it outside of town hall. Or I can go to the Little League field with my pack of cigarettes, but I can't have my cigarette while I'm watching the game. So that's kind of the comparison I was drawing. And I hope that clarifies it.
Yeah, got it. Thank you.
Yeah. You talked about some public space prohibitions. My reading of the bill also allows the town to regulate outdoor commercial spaces, like outdoor restaurant spaces as well.
That's correct, and I believe violations of that can be substantial fines to restaurant owners. So it sort of goes towards that same intent. You don't want people to smoke cannabis at an outdoor patio table right next to a family out to dinner. So that's kind of what it is. And like your reading is correct, in my opinion. The act does allow for that.
Jen?
Did I also read, Vincent, in the act that we could extend the prohibition of smoking even to town-owned properties such as sidewalks, if we didn't want people walking up and down our main street and smoking cannabis? Was that in there?
Yeah, that to my knowledge and opinion, yes, that's a correct statement. And I believe, off the top of my head, I believe Bethany has imposed a restriction like that where it's banned on sidewalks. And that's also in my paper. I could be wrong on the town, but there definitely is a town that has banned use on sidewalks. It might also be Orange.
Okay, great, thank you.
Okay, so another question I've got, we have a large outdoor space that's not town owned. That is the green in downtown Madison, is owned by the First Congregational Church. Would we look to regulate that space, or would we look to FCC to set their own policy?
That's an interesting question, and I wouldn't be confident giving you an answer on whether you can regulate that because it's not town owned. To the extent it's town controlled, I don't know either. For instance, does Public Works mow the lawn there?
So we have a cooperative relationship.
Yeah, so I mean, if it's town maintained or town controlled to an extent, based on my reading of the act, that's something that would potentially be able to be regulated by the town. But to the extent that it's church owned, church controlled, I don't know that the town would be able to do something like that. But to the extent there's sidewalks around it that the town owns, that would be a location that they can regulate.
Right. Now, the church would be free to set a policy for their property, right?
Certainly.
Okay.
And also for potentially town events on the property. I think the town would have the ability in using that property, for concerts and things like that. There may be a policy that can be done by the town, that at town-sponsored events.
Yeah, I guess what I'm thinking is the cart and the horse. We probably want to reach out to FCC and see what they're doing. I would imagine, since they already have a ban on alcohol on the green, that they would extend it to cannabis as well. But I would hate for us to not do anything thinking that they're setting a policy, and them to not do anything because they think we're setting a policy. So I think it requires a brief conversation.
I have a question regarding state parks. So we're fortunate to have Hammonasset, and I know Hammonasset prohibits alcohol consumption. Is there any knowledge on how cannabis would be allowed or disallowed there? And then also, I believe we provide the policing and emergency services as a town, correct me if I'm wrong, to Hammonasset. So how would that affect all of our emergency responders in terms of just a knowledge base in responding to town issues versus issues at Hammonasset, if there are different rules and regulations?
So if I can just add to that, as far as coverage inside the Hammonasset Park there, deep, the officers that have the green uniforms, the state environmental protection, they cover the state parks throughout the state. We do get dispatched in there if there's an emergency, like a medical or something that's happening that it needs an immediate response, but ultimately deep officers will respond, even if it's after the fact, because that's their jurisdiction. So they
Okay.
would handle any particular violations of cannabis or anything like that.
Okay,
Yeah,
Um,
and to the extent the town would regulate there, I believe it would be up to the state to do that, but
And it's
considering the
definitely the
state,
state.
yeah,
Right.
considering the state has banned alcohol there, I'm sure there's also smoking prohibited areas there. I'm sure the state would take some sort of affirmative action as it relates to cannabis there as well.
It's my understanding the state has prohibited public consumption of cannabis in state parks, state beaches, and on state waters.
Yes, I believe that's
that-
true.
That was in one of the seminars I attended.
okay, great, thank you.
Vinny, I want to thank you for, initially I had this kind of presentation came to fruition in a partnership with attorney Marjorie Shansky, who is a professor both at Quinnipiac Law and at Yale as well. And she's a land use attorney also who represents various clients that we have seen before us in land use agencies. And in the past, students have done presentations and catered their research to the specific needs of our municipality as we have suggested to them. And they've made presentations to the Conservation Commission and Coastal Resiliency Commission in the past. And marijuana was a topic of interest for sure. So I really appreciate the time that you have taken, Vinny, to specifically look at Madison's charge of our committee and weed through this 300+ page bill to give us this good oversight. And I think this is something that's beneficial to the committee. It's not just staff that's here or representatives from various commissions. We have public residents as members, and I find this really helpful. So I do appreciate your efforts, and I know Elise is another student at Quinnipiac who has looked to explore the economic aspects, specifically with respect to this new legislative happenings. And she would hope to be able to present to the committee at a future date, or even the Economic Development Commission. I know our representative, we kind of have a conflict this evening with meetings. But I think this is a great partnership to have with the school, and I appreciate all of your efforts. And
Yeah,
Marjorie's as well. I know she's here in attendance too.
Yeah, thank you for setting this up, Aaron, and I really appreciate the opportunity to do this, and I hope it is as helpful as it can be for you all in guiding your decisions.
Well, Vincent, thank you very much. You know what? You're welcome to stay on for the rest of the agenda if you just want to
Excuse
see the conversation. Oh, Fillmore?
Yeah, yes, excuse me. I had another question before Vince leaves. And this has to do with the income side of it. You went through some numbers back a few minutes ago about how many millions of dollars might come to various towns. Some of those numbers sounded very nice, but for a town that has only one retail outlet, I doubt if we're going to be getting $20 million. Do you have any breakout as to the expected income from that 3% sales tax per retail outlet. Was that
Yeah.
part?
So I don't have a specific number that would compare to a town the size of Madison. Like I said, it's about 10 million annually in all of Michigan on average. I'm sure Detroit's numbers, for instance, are significantly higher than a suburb in Michigan. But that's an average. So Madison, as a smaller town, you would expect, less revenue than New Haven or Bridgeport or Hartford. But with a 10 million average, you can probably expect, I would assume based on that average, if it translated perfectly, somewhere a little bit shy of 10 million based on the smaller size of Madison and the one establishment.
So you're saying we would get $10 million a year?
That's correct in Michigan. That's the average municipal revenue in Michigan based on a pool of all the towns averaged out.
And what percentage of the sales are they getting back as a municipality?
So they have a similar tax structure to Connecticut, where I believe it's 3% or something very close to that.
So that means that the one shop is going to be taking in $300 million a year. That sounds a little steep.
The numbers were amazing to me too, and I went to law school, so I'm by no means am I a mathematician, but the numbers were astronomical to me, and to the extent that they're correct, it's quite an implication for municipalities statewide.
Thank you.
One more question, Vince, regarding the finances. You mentioned that the tax revenue is put into trust initially, and then it comes back down to the state, or I'm sorry, back down to the municipality. So that's managed up at the state level?
Yeah, so it's kind of an intricate process, and it's outlined in the act. But essentially, the sales are reported to the state, and the retail establishment would report their gross sales, and the state would approve those. And in the meantime, while the state is acting on the revenues, the sales tax to the municipality will be held in a trust, and the municipality would designate a municipal employee to be in charge of the tax issues with retail establishments. And then once things are cleared up with the state, that money in trust would be transferred over to the municipality to use for those 6 revenue sources that I mentioned earlier.
And is there any idea in terms of timeline, what that turnaround typically looks like from when the money is received to when it's released back to the municipality?
Yeah, so the act has a strict timeline, and I don't want to give it to you because I don't really know it off the top of my head. But I'm pretty sure there's 60 days at the state, and then once it's approved, I believe it's a 30-day period to which it turns around to the town.
Okay, thank you.
All right, anyone else have questions or general thoughts, comments? All right, so Vincent, like I said earlier, you're welcome to hang around and see us work through some of these other agenda items, or if you have someplace to be. You've been very generous with your time. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me. Thank you for the questions. Thank you for hearing me out. And I hope it's as helpful as it can be.
Good. All right, so moving along, the next couple of agenda items are really me trying to get us to take positive steps forward on some of the specific charge items. The public hearing did not have the turnout that I was hoping for. And in retrospect, it might be just, it was a little bit too blank sheet of paper for people to get interested in. So my thought is that we begin to discuss and take action on some of the recommendations that we need to do, with the idea that we would then be bringing those decisions in pencil to another public hearing to get reaction from people who are interested. Again, we're taking action, but my intention is that we are doing it so that when we go to our second public interaction, that we'll have something for the public to react to. So with that context, I have item number 3, discuss and take action on a recommendation to the Board of Selectmen regarding the prohibition of retail sales and commercial production and processing of cannabis and its derivative byproducts. So that is a motion that needs a second for us to discuss.
I'll second.
Okay, and so for people that aren't familiar with Robert's rules, what we do is we move, we second, and then we discuss before we take a vote. So we're now in the discussion phase, and clearly I've put up the word prohibition as a place for us to start the discussion. There is room in this conversation for us to modify that, but I am anxious to hear everybody's thoughts. David.
Yeah, just a question, and I wasn't sure. I know we did a poll, and I'm not sure how much feedback or what the results were on that, or if we haven't even got anybody to reply to that poll. Was there a consensus or any?
There was really no response, and there was no consensus. I think the responses we got was from you folks.
Okay.
Fillmore, I think you had your hand up.
Yes. I am in favor of the prohibition. I do not think that we need to go down the road of allowing cannabis sales or growth. So I think that maybe it's just me, but I don't think it's a good idea. I think it's a bad road. Yes, we might get a little bit of money out of it, but again, I think the morals of it are speak against cannabis sales. So I'm in favor of the motion to not allow it. Thank you.
I'm kind of hoping somebody puts their hand up and says, no, I have a different opinion. David.
Sure, I'll take somewhat of the opposite view and say I disagree, I guess. I'll start out by saying I don't necessarily know that there's a place in Madison to put a retail place or a grow facility to start with. So I wouldn't necessarily vote, absolutely, but I wouldn't say no just based on kind of moral grounds. I think we've certainly accepted liquor stores. We've accepted, cigarette selling retail locations, and to say, just no because it's been kind of vilified over the years is probably not a great option for us. I mean, having said that, though, from a practical point of view, I'm not sure where we would put a retail location here in town, so I wouldn't necessarily push too hard for it. But I mean, I would be more of a pro vote, or the opposite of prohibiting it.
Sure. Jack. No, I think you're muted. We can't hear you. No, still can't hear you.
How about
Oh,
now?
there. I think we got you now.
Oh, okay, hold on. I need to. There we go. Okay. I switched my speakers out there for a second. All right. Yeah, okay. I sort of have the same reasons for saying I'd be against prohibition. I guess in the same way we sort of just tacitly accepted alcohol when it was re-legalized in 1933. I mean, I guess we can go back into like the record and see if there was a alcohol legalization advisory committee when prohibition ended. But I think, there are still the same social ills with alcohol that we are okay with, and that we've accepted over the years, as it's been more or less been made ubiquitous in American society, whereas we're just getting the legalization of marijuana now in Connecticut, and we're only maybe 18 of 50 states that have legalized it recreationally. And there's talk of, who knows when the federal government might or might not change its laws anytime soon. So yeah, I guess I'm sort of, are we going to legalize it or not? I don't know entirely. And it'd be interesting to see how we, I guess, sort of figure out how we answer this question in terms of, I know some towns have put it to a vote to the voters on a ballot. Some have just said, we're just going to go through a town meeting and have people come into the town meeting and say whether or not they want this bill to pass or not. So, I think I'm someone who would be in favor of it. I'm someone who thinks that with all the bad things that alcohol brings, I think marijuana is a little bit less bad than alcohol. I mean, I wouldn't, trust anybody to drive with it, or, we need to make sure also that, parents are told to like put, marijuana gummies away so that their kids don't get it. There's those implications with legalization. But I think just going ahead with prohibition and saying no, I don't know if that's necessarily the right route. I think at least it needs to be thought about.
Sure. So I'd like to explore more the notion that you brought up about a townwide vote, and the idea that is this group or even the Board of Selectmen the right group to be making this decision for the town, given our town meeting legislative structure. Should our recommendation to the board be that they send this out to a referendum vote?
I think the town should have input. I think we should hear different point of views so that when a decision is made, if we decide ultimately who makes the decision, at least we have more points of views and awareness for us to make the best decision we can make. There's so many ways, you can think of it one way and then you hear other points of views and then you change your point of view. So I think involving the town would definitely be a smart way to go.
Giselle, do you think that it should be two separate thoughts, the retail sale and the cultivation production? Do you think that they stand alone as the same thought, or they're separate?
I think they're separate because they are separate. They're two different things. So I think they are separate.
David?
Yeah, so the other issue, and 2 points, I guess. One is, do we have, looking at whether we even put a vote to the public, do we have the zoning in place to have a retail location in a commercial district that's not within 500 feet of a school or whatever other restrictions we're going to put on? Because, having a vote and then not having a viable location for a retail shop is kind of senseless. So I think we just have to make sure we knew kind of zoning, what we would be looking for, or where we'd be even considering having it placed, and if there's even a reasonable option there. And then second, I'll just touch on kind of the financial stuff real quick, because when you said $10 million per municipality out of Michigan, I mean, that number's outrageous, I think, to be honest with you. I mean, from personal experience, I know there's, the existing medical dispensaries in Connecticut, one of them, which is extremely busy, was constantly running. it was probably running 12 to 14 million dollars a year gross. It's another dispensary I'm familiar with out of state that runs extremely busy, high volume, but again, probably grosses, 15 to 18 million dollars a year. And that's this super busy, two super busy locations. And again, there's no guarantee that just having recreational use is going to outdo those existing medical facilities. I mean, to be honest with you, most of the people that want to get involved with legal cannabis probably got their medical card and continue to use those facilities rather than just pop into a adult use rec shop anyway. So there's definitely money to be made out there, but it certainly is not $10 million for the town of Madison.
Aaron, any thoughts on the physical space?
I wasn't sure if I could talk because you're in the middle of a motion.
No, we're discussing.
Okay. So yes, I think this, in your proposal here for prohibition is not just related to retail, but also to commercial production and processing of cannabis. And so those are important to note and differentiate between the two uses and whether one may be preferred or a different, banning retail versus allowing some type of industrial use. Those are options as well. We do have commercial, to answer your question, David, we do have commercial zones that are not within 500 feet of schools or churches. I mean, you look at the east end of the Post Road, those are commercial districts. And we don't have any churches or schools right near there. That may affect downtown. You may look for specifics downtown, but basically our commercial zones are on the gateways into town on the Post Road. Industrial zones, light industrial zones are near along the train station, the train corridor there, I should say. But so there are possibilities of locations. And as far as the public referendum option, there is authority for that in the statute. And I don't know, it specifically refers to a petition of the residents to the, a petition of not less than 10% of the electors of any municipality. So that petition lodged with the town clerk at least 60 days before the date of any regular election, then the selectmen shall warn of that vote to be taken, and it specifically states out the language that would have to be used in that. So there is some guidance for a public referendum option as well, as opposed to an outright ban or regulating.
So is there any consensus among the group that maybe the proper way here is that we recommend a referendum question and engage the legislative body of the town?
I would be in favor of that.
I would suggest not. I'm sorry, I didn't have my hand up. If we enacting an ordinance goes part way there anyway, because Bruce, correct me if I misspeak, but I think that before we have an ordinance, there has to be at least a public hearing, and it requires I believe it's 4 out of the 5 of the selectmen, so it's not some sort of 3-2 bare majority. An ordinance does require a pretty stiff response. But I do have a couple of other comments. Speaking as I said earlier, I am against the sale in total. One of the reasons is I go back to one of the earlier presentations that we had, back in the day when smoking a joint was all the rage, I had a power of like 1% or 2%. But I believe I recall that what is out there now is up to 30%. So that's like comparing a can of beer to a jug of moonshine, straight still. And so I think that the fact that it's so potent out there that I think we need to take that into consideration. And also, the last time we spoke, the captain was explaining how the police could tell if somebody was under the influence, and yeah, there's no breathalyzer. That, you know, you have to go through a long process, and you come up with a guess as to whether they're under the influence if they're weaving down the road. So those are some of the reasons that I'm against the whole thing. Thank you.
Jack, I think you had your hand up first.
Yeah, so I'm thinking with the referendum versus town meeting. I mean, I guess town meeting, you could also, I'd have to look at the charter, but you could theoretically have the ordinance right there, and then people can just discuss it like we're discussing right now, and then there's a vote, and then it becomes law, or it goes to the board of selectmen, and then I don't know how exactly it works after that. But you know, there's the ability to sort of get people to understand, like, hey, this is how our town works. I don't know if people know for the fact that, you know, by virtue of being a voter here, you can actually, you're a legislator as well. You have two titles as a resident of Madison. But I mean, then again, maybe it's just easier to just, when you're, I would assume if we're putting this to a referendum, I mean, it would make no fiscal sense, at least, to like put this to a ballot like in the middle of summer or something like that. It'd probably make more sense to have it when people are going to vote for governor or vote for, you know, the midterm elections in November. So I mean, I guess those two competing ways of thinking about how we should go about this is maybe something to consider. And then I'd also be in favor of splitting up whether or not sales should be legal, whether or not cultivation should be legal. Because I think maybe I need to go back and to the law and read it, but I think if we have a cultivator in town, we could still get that 3% municipal tax, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe we don't, I don't know. But like, you know, if that's being given to, you know, dispensaries in New Haven or dispensaries in Middletown, then that's a way for us to sort of, you know, be able to, you know, maybe use that towards mental health services, or use that towards whatever we want to under the provisions, and still, you know, we ourselves don't feel like partaking in it.
David.
Yeah, I would just kind of add, you know, I think the fact that we've had kind of poor public turnout for just these discussions leads me to believe that if we kind of settle on something and put it out there without public voting on it, it's just going to create havoc. And then, you know, everybody's going to pop out of nowhere and say, you know, why'd they make these decisions without us? And nobody told us about these meetings, and nobody gave us a say.
They're going to say that anyways.
The other issue is, let's not forget, and I try to bring this up, that just because if adult use marijuana retail location opens up in a town, it doesn't mean we're going to turn everybody in that town into dope fiends. It just really allows the people that have been using marijuana for the last entirety of their lives, which is probably a larger percentage of people than anyone thinks, the opportunity to go and get a safer, well-tested option, although admittedly a higher potency than what it was many years ago, probably not that much higher potency than what they're buying from their street level dealer at this point, though.
Hopefully slightly less fentanyl in it.
Yeah.
I would just add that whatever Madison does, towns around us inevitably will. And with the advent of home delivery of marijuana, the law enforcement challenge doesn't go away regardless of what we do. It will be here in legal and illegal methods regardless. And Jack, I'm gonna invite Fillmore to correct me when I go astray here, but the town meeting and the referendum are the same legislative process. The referendum is simply an extension of the town meeting intended to get more voter involvement. Fillmore, are you on board with that? Oh, he just froze. So that means,
Bruce, I'm breaking you up. I can't hear you. I think it's, yeah,
oh. So we're losing you there for a minute, Fillmore. You're frozen.
hold on 1 second. Hold on. Okay. No, okay, thank you. I was just checking on my own connection. I'm sorry, go ahead again, Bruce.
I was just saying that the town meeting and the referendum are functionally the same legislative process. That the referendum is simply an attempt to get more voter engagement than we might get at a town meeting.
I think that's basically true, that a referendum is basically, yes, is an extension of the town meeting.
Right. So I think what I've heard, and importantly, what I've heard from Giselle and Jack and David is a preference for a townwide vote. And since we specifically asked for you to be on this panel to get new perspectives, I would like to amend my motion that that this group recommend to the Board of Selectmen a townwide referendum, 2 questions, one pertaining to the retail sale of cannabis, and the other to the production and processing of cannabis. And I'll allow that maybe that wording needs to be cleaned up a little bit or to be a little more technical. But my intent is that we distinguish between the manufacture, growing, processing, packaging, and the retail sales as questions put to voters. With that, I will ask for a second again on that.
Second.
Second.
Since I seconded the original, I will second your amendment.
Okay, thank you. And I'll invite any further discussion.
Yes, I had another question. It's unlikely that we would have this resolved in this manner, well, let's say until we get to the November election or somewhere in several months out. As I recall, the law aren't we under some sort of a timeline that says we have to do something by June or July? Am I mistaken?
So Aaron, do you
have
want
a
to?
temporary moratorium that may need to be amended to reflect if we need more time.
Right. So planning and zoning took action. That action expires after 9 months. But I believe they could vote to extend that.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
So we have the retail space, and then we have the cultivators. So when I know there also exists laboratories that do the quality control. Would that fall under cultivator? I guess that would be processing, maybe. I'm not 100%, but just to add.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point. I've tried to kind of come up with an umbrella term for anything related to the marijuana that isn't retail. And we may need to refine that language a little bit to be more precise.
Okay. But I see what you're doing, and yeah, I understand.
But I think the core thought is here that we're you know, we would be voting to recommend sending these questions to the voters of the town, and not making the decision ourselves, or recommending that the Board of Selectmen make the decision themselves. All right, well, so if there's no more discussion, I'll call the question. So all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All right, all those against say nay. Okay. The motion passes. Next item on the agenda, to discuss and take action on a recommendation of the Board of Selectmen regarding regulations on usage on town-owned or other properties subject to regulation by Senate Bill 1201. So I will ask for a second on that motion.
I'll second.
Oh, no. The thought here is that the Board of Selectmen will enact regulations. I probably should have put ordinance in there, as allowed by, and consistent with the Senate bill, to enact regulations on town-owned, town-controlled spaces. So I haven't attempted to define what those regulations are. They would just simply be regulations in harmony with what the Senate bill allows.
Mhm.
I guess I'll start. I think it makes sense if we try to make them congruent with what we have with respect to tobacco and alcohol. I guess in places where alcohol intoxication is an issue, or where we at least prohibit it, we should also include, you know, not just smokable marijuana, but also edibles as well, probably. So maybe, like, I'm thinking Surf Club, for example, East Wharf, West Wharf. Maybe we also do extend that to you know, town events on the green. I think that would only make sense to make sure all three, you know, substances we can think of are all going to be the same, just for a purely, just so people don't, like, you know, get confused or anything like that. I feel like being consistent across all tobacco, alcohol, and cannabis, I feel like makes sense.
Sure.
Jack, I didn't get all of what you said because my computer was breaking up. So if I'm repeating what you said, I apologize. Well, I think we should include not allowing it on sidewalks and some of the outdoor dining spaces as well. Make it all inclusive.
I agree. I'm going to expand a little bit on that thought. I think the you know, the outdoor restaurants, the sidewalks are going to be important spaces. I think as a follow through to this, if we do have agreement on this, we might either as a subgroup, or we might go back to staff and say, can you find the applicable regulations and ordinances, and suggest how they might be amended to incorporate cannabis.
Right. Mhm.
And then I think, Captain Harkins, if you see a space where there's room for improvement, on the ordinances in general, since we'll be amending them. That would be a good time to do that. Or if there's a space that isn't otherwise speaking to this that law enforcement is concerned about, then we would certainly want to pick that up.
I
Yep.
think that's a great start.
Any other thoughts, comments?
I was just
Okay.
gonna add that the policy committee for the Board of Ed, we just went through a similar process with updating a bunch of policies in the 1000 series regarding that typically regarded smoking and alcohol, and we had to make amendments to those to now include cannabis usage as well. So I definitely think starting with what's already in place, is going to help to ensure missing fewer things. And I'm also in agreement with Fillmore, in regards to making sure that we protect our sidewalk areas as well. Just, you can't have an open container. You shouldn't be able to have cannabis in smoke or edible form.
All right, with that, I'll call the question. We can take a vote. All those in favor? Say aye.
Aye.
All right, so that's unanimous. Item number 5, the motion is to discuss, take action, a recommendation on the establishment of a municipal sales tax as described in Senate Bill 1201. So not presupposing a positive or negative outcome. Well, actually, before I start going into that, do I have a second?
Second.
Okay, David?
Second.
So the thought there is that we can recommend that the town enact this sales tax. Should at referendum the question get defeated, this would still stand, and then in a future date, if it were changed, it would be there. So they're a little hand in glove, but they're not technically connected to each other. I believe we can have a sales tax in place and no sales. I also think, and I'm going to direct this at Fillmore, I think this is probably ultimately the domain of the Board of Finance. So while we may make this recommendation to the Board of Selectmen, it probably gets rolled over as a recommendation to the Board of Finance. Do you agree with that?
That's a good question. I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I was going to, on a different tack, I was going to suggest that we could just table this until we get the outcome of, a town meeting or a referendum. But if we want to move ahead and get it on the books, in case it passes, I have no objection to that.
Yeah, so I think your logic is sound. This was one of the discrete tasks that we had. So, we could recommend that we don't do anything until we know the outcome of a townwide vote, or we could just do it.
We can go ahead. That's all right.
Any other thoughts?
I just have one. I find it a little confusing if we prohibit retail or processing, manufacturing, why we would have a tax on the books for use that's not allowed. So my thought is that if it doesn't pass and the town ends up with a prohibition, that it doesn't make sense to have a tax on the books. That's just my 2 cents.
Well, I mean, like Fillmore's logic, your logic is strong. I would, since this was a specific charge, I would like us to take some action. Now, as I said before, the action can be contingent upon a successful referendum question. But I think that because we were asked this question, we need to provide some response back. So Jen, what have you got?
So if the referendum is successful, what would the turnaround time be, that space of time between the referendum and when sales were allowed? And then if we had to go back to the table and figure out what a sales tax was going to be within that time frame, would we be limiting ourselves in any way? No.
I don't think so. It's all pretty well prescribed. And look, we could approve as a town any number of establishments. It is the state ultimately that's going to decide how many, and even if we get anything.
Okay.
So, and we can only get 3%. So we can't decide exactly what the amount is. It's a fixed 3%. Let's hear from David.
Is having that in place prior to any referendum or vote may sway the vote, whether that's good or bad, and that people would know in advance that if there's a retail location, then yes, there's already a plan in the books for a 3% tax that goes to the town. Whereas if it weren't in place prior, it would be something like, well, if this passes, then there have to be another vote to see if there's a tax that goes to the town. I mean, it may sway people in one direction or the other. I mean, that's the only advantage if you're pro, and disadvantage if you're against, I guess.
That's a good thought. All right, thanks. Jack. You're muted. Here you go.
Yeah, it's I'm thinking, I'm torn of like, why go through the process if nothing happens in the first place. But at the same time, I mean, the interesting thing about like the limited amount of things we can do with it sort of brings up an interesting point. I think I'm not too familiar with alcohol and tobacco taxes with respect to Connecticut, but might present a unique opportunity to have a substance that has potential of being abused and potentially leading to an addiction. Actually, some of those sales now going back into a service or to a department in our town that actually will be affected by those things. So I think at minimum, if there even is something to that effect, whether or not we decide before or after the referendum on what happens, I find it interesting that that's something that can happen. And I personally would be in favor of at least putting, I don't know, not a small percentage of that tax revenue towards a department or, youth and family services or mental health and addiction services or something like that, towards the damage that might be caused by that. Whereas, if I'm remembering correctly, and I once again don't know exactly, like when you go to buy a beer or pack of beer, you don't really get the breakdown of what happens with the taxes afterwards. But if I'm not mistaken, it seems like with those substances, there's nothing going back, whereas this is a unique opportunity, I guess.
So I think that's an excellent thought. The idea that we would include in our recommendation where those potential tax dollars should go. Jack, I'm going to just put a nuance on your thought. Youth and Family Services is not serving the entire community as a mission. They are servicing a discrete portion, an important portion of Madison's community. But proceeds going to public health and proceeds going to law enforcement, those would be the two likely groups that would feel something, and maybe some sort of split to those groups or or all to one or the other, is called for. I don't know, is that resonating with the rest of the group?
Yes.
Okay. So, Aaron and Fillmore bring up really good points. And maybe the right motion here is to tie it to contingent upon a successful referendum question that that we would enact the sales tax if the town decided to allow retail sales and production. So I am happy to amend my motion with that provision. I'm also happy to add in Jack's idea that we recommend the specific recipients of those future tax dollars. So I will make those changes. I'm going to add in public health and law enforcement. I'm going to identify those two as recipients. I think, David, you seconded the motion originally. If you're willing to second the amendment, I would love to hear everybody's thoughts on that amendment.
Yeah, I'll second that.
I have a,
You're
I
breaking
have
up.
a comment. I have a comment about the last phrase you inserted, Bruce. I think Jack's thoughts were excellent as to where down the road should all this take place, the money should go. But I don't think we should tie the use of the funds into this particular motion because situations do change, and I think that Jack's ideas were good.
Oh, Fillmore, you were a victim of a bad connection tonight. Sorry, we lost most of that, Fillmore.
Okay.
No, you're all frozen.
As well thought as Jack's comments were as to where the money should go, I don't think we should be. Did I get frozen again?
Yeah, you did.
Oh boy. I'll try one more time, and maybe that's something to saying that what I'm saying isn't worth listening to, but I'll try it one more time. That Jack's thoughts were good as to where the money should go, but I don't think we should be tying in our recommendation. I don't think we should be tying it. We shouldn't be tying it to any particular use. Does that make it?
Well, I think we got the general idea. I think your suggestion is that we don't recommend the recipients of the revenue dollars, that we simply just recommend that we put a sales tax in place pending a successful referendum.
Okay, yeah.
If I can add, so can you hear me?
Yes.
So if the town votes to prohibit, where do we go from there? Do we reevaluate this in the next 2 years, 5 years, 10 years? Or do we just leave it as that? How do we move forward with that vote?
So I believe, Aaron, jump in and correct me if you think I've got it wrong. The vote would stand until some group petitioned under the statute to have it put back on as a referendum question. So, or a future board could reevaluate and bring it back up.
Okay,
Um,
It's ultimately for an ordinance, correct? That you're establishing an ordinance to prohibit. So if, and you're doing that through a referendum, right? So if someone down the road or the board or, proposes a change to that, then it would follow the standard procedures, I would think, it wouldn't necessarily require a referendum, but it may would be the standard process for a town meeting, for updating an ordinance.
So certainly if the Board of Selectmen wanted to revisit it, that would be the way to go. If there was a group that was unhappy with the outcome, they could petition their way to having the question revisited, which I think Giselle, it would take a board to say they wanted to pick the question up again and amend the decision, which would then go to town meeting, or it would be a group trying to avail themselves of the path in the statute that allows them with sufficient signatures to petition their way onto a ballot.
right, okay.
Otherwise, it would stay status quo
Right.
indefinitely.
Okay, that's what I wanted to. Perfect.
All right, so the amendment to the amendment, I think, proposed is that we not specify where the money goes. If there's no objection to that, we can drop it. If we feel strongly about it, we keep it in and take the vote. I'll just do a sort of a straw poll here.
Yeah, and the 3% tax, I'm sorry, I'm going back to
Yeah.
that's today. But if they revisit it 5-10 years from now, that 3% may turn out to be 3.8 or 4.5. So,
Or one,
or
right.
one.
right? The state could sweep it back into their funds.
Right, so, we can say 3%, but I think we need to make sure they understand that's current, I guess. I don't know if that, I don't know.
No. I think it's a fair point that 3% is the maximum. I suppose we could choose to collect less sales tax. I don't know why we would do that. So we would just go for the maximum that the state is allowing.
That would be a great way to say that, yeah.
So I'm having trouble getting a sense. Do you guys agree with Fillmore, or do you?
I agree. You mean with not including how we're gonna spend the money?
Exactly.
Yeah, I agree. We can state where the options, like what was on the PowerPoint, but nothing definitive. I don't know. I think that's how I'm thinking right now. But that's not to say the money won't go there, more than likely it probably would, but I think the more awareness we bring to the town, the better.
Okay. And remember, part of the purpose of these votes is in preparation of our next public hearing, where we'll present to the town what we intend to recommend to the Board of Selectmen. So should we get a good engaged group and some new thinking on it, we will have the opportunity to incorporate that new input and revisit these questions. So we're not setting anything in stone tonight. We're simply giving positions a little bit more firm that the town can react to when we come back to them in another public hearing. So then, okay, so I'm not going to belabor this anymore. The motion in front of us is to enact a sales tax pending the successful referendum, and that the money would be allocated as allowed by Senate Bill 1201.
Second.
So all in favor?
Aye.
All right, so the
Aye.
motion carries. Okay, the final thing. So this one is a little nuanced, but I'll make the motion, discuss and take action to recommend that regulations pertaining to cannabis be enacted by town ordinance. So I will look for a second, Jack. Okay, so the idea here is town ordinance is law in the town as opposed to policy. So it carries the weight of penalties and consequences in a way that policies don't always do. So this was part of what Vincent was talking about, recommending that the regulations on sidewalks, the regulations at the surf club, the regulations in other public spaces be managed via ordinance and not policy. And so my motion is that we do that. There will be some planning and zoning stuff that does happen through planning and zoning. So we're not usurping the natural authority of planning and zoning and their policies. We're simply taking those normal ordinance related, town law related issues and treating them as such.
I agree with you.
I think Fillmore's frozen again.
Yeah, I agree with you too. Last I heard was Giselle saying she agreed with you, so I'll also agree.
All right. Any other thoughts, comments? All right, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
All right. That's no nays, so the motion carries. Everyone, I want to thank you for your time tonight. We aspire to do this in an hour. We're at an hour and a half. But I think we learned some good stuff tonight, and we covered some good ground. So thank you for your engagement. Thank you for volunteering. And I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
All right, and we'll say Fillmore seconded it. And with that, we are done for the evening. Thank you all, and have a great night and have a great weekend.
You as
Thank
well.
you.
Have a good one.